Hello everyone and welcome to Cornerstone Cosplay. My name is Chris and we are on the final installment of Hiccup's helmet build from How to Train Your Dragon 3, The Hidden World. So, let's finish this one up.
So I went ahead and prepped a few more patterns. These cover the face mask, eye cover, and back panels. From there, I did a little more math to figure out the height of the fin on the top of the helmet. This ended up being 2¼ inches up. I prepped a cardboard test piece to make sure I could get the curvature right. From here, it's looking pretty good, but I'm going to test it in just a couple more steps. Here, I prepped my upper helmet pieces for gluing them together. Just make sure to be in a well-ventilated area when you use this stuff. I also recommend a ventilator because this stuff is really bad for you to be breathing. Once I had my panels glued, I taped my final seam to test that I had everything fitting correctly. Everything looked good, including the curvature on the fin. So, at this point, I moved on to getting ready to do some stitching. So I cut a left and a right side out of this fin so that I could have a smooth facing piece of leather on both sides. I also added a little bit of a seam so that can go inside of the helmet and actually hold the fin in place from the inside. And after getting these cut out, I got them prepped to glue them together. I beveled all the edges to make sure they show. And then later on I slicked them a little bit. I always recommend to slick and bevel all of your seams. It makes a huge difference in making your projects look more professional, and it also makes everything that you wear a bit more comfortable. In this case, I still beveled and slicked all of my edges, even though all of them had a bit of battle wear. That I just took care of after the fact by sort of scraping some of the edges to give them a rougher look. However, I will always make sure to do beveling and slicking on all of my projects. Everything looked good, so I moved on to stitching. You want a piece of granite, a cutting board, a stitching chisel, and a mallet. From here, we can start punching our holes into both the fin and the portions of the helmet. As a pro tip here, when you're using a stitching chisel, make sure to line up your next hit with the last hole that you just punched. It'll make sure that everything always ends up with a perfect spacing. Now, if you'd like to see a bit more of an in-depth stitching tutorial, drop a comment below. Now here, I just used a basic saddle stitch, and I added a small thin strip to the inside, just to give me a little bit more bite as I was stitching through everything. This also helped to hold the two edges together where the fin wasn't attached. Now, in order to get a good border on the eye protectors, I decided to use a tool called a border tool. What's funny is a lot of these tools lack some inventive names, but at least they say exactly what they do. This tool has a guide like the stitching groover, but uses a swivel knife blade to make the cut. Just make sure that you're holding the blade at a 45-degree angle to get a good and proper cut. Make sure everything is nice and tight before you get started. And then you should be good to go. Before we actually make any of our cuts, we're going to want to make sure that we actually wet the leather. That's what's going to allow it to actually make a proper impression and cut. In this case, we are going to wet both sides because the front has a finish on it, and it makes it a little bit harder for the water to absorb from there. So if you wet it from the back, you don't want to soak it, but you want to make sure that the water is absorbing into the leather. Once I was ready to go, I used the border tool around the exterior, and then I also used it around the eye holes. Definitely make sure you're being careful with this tool because you don't really get a second try on the same piece. After finishing all the borders, I decided to create the bridge piece for the nose by tracing the area of the eyepieces. After that, I'll be adhering that piece to the mask portion. That's when I noticed that I need to make this just a little bit skinnier. Now we're good. All right, I'm happy with that. At this time, I traced and cut out the face mask portion of the helmet. The split that you see in the center is what's going to allow it to have some curvature across the front of the helmet. And if you notice, that angle is very much the same as the fin on the top of the helmet. There is a reason for that, because he does flip his face mask up, and it needs to be able to fit on there without being intrusive to either part. Now, by including this little split in the center, it also makes it a lot easier to get that curve without having to wet form as heavily later. Now, a 45-degree angle was cut into the flesh side of the split that allows the seam to not really show in the front if I glue everything together nice and smoothly. After that, I got everything ready to go to do a little bit more stitching. Here, I used a baseball stitch. To start this, I used a curved awl blade to be able to put some pre-existing holes into the leather. Makes it a lot easier to stitch by doing that, and it also allows me to go through just the flesh side of the leather, because I didn't want the stitching showing on the front. And now I got my head in the way. And that is one thing about hand stitching. It does take a little while, but it is one of the strongest stitches you could possibly get. But in the end, I think all the time is going to be worth it. Now, when you measure out stitching thread, you generally want to go about 2 to 3 times the distance that you're going to be covering with it. Unless you're doing something where you're wrapping the thread around, then you want to accommodate a little bit more. I look at it like this. Thread is fairly cheap, and I'd rather have a little bit too much and trim off the excess and use it for something else later, rather than having to worry about splicing in new thread or not being able to complete the area that I'm trying to stitch. There is nothing worse than running out of thread while you're in the middle of a project. So, I like to overcompensate by a little bit. A neat little trick to prevent your thread from popping off is taking the short end of the thread, and if you pierce the needle about halfway through that piece of thread and slide it down, and you pull it down over the end of the needle, it's going to act similarly to when somebody will tie a knot at the end of the thread, except it won't bulk it up. So it'll keep it from pulling through, but it'll also keep it from being harder to pull through the holes. Then, after I finished all the stitching, I started to lay out my smooth border lines. These are kind of the in-between sections where all the scales went. I pre-marked them, made a little piece out of tape, and then I stuck those onto my stitched face mask. I made it a little bit easier to see where I was going with it. Once I got all the lines laid down, I roughed up the surfaces in between using a detail rougher. The way this tool works is it has a bunch of fine file-like bits right at the end of the tool. Now make sure to exercise caution with this tool, because if you scuff up the wrong spot, you can't really fix it, at least not very easily. So take your time, practice it on a small piece first, just to make sure you got the feel for the tool, as you see here. I often recommend to go a few swipes in one direction. And then you're going to want to flip the piece around and then cross hatch it. It roughs up the area a little bit easier, so things like adhesives can stick better in those areas. And now comes the majorly labor-intensive part. I was pretty happy with how these scales turned out, so I'm going to show you a bit of the process of what I went through to create them. Now, going over everything, I figured out that I'm going to need probably over 2,000 of these individual scales for the entire armor, but here I started with making a little over 400 of them. I started by cutting the pieces out of a thicker vegetable tanned leather. Here it's about 12-ounce leather, and I cut it at an angle from the front. This leaves a bit of a lip that I'm able to use to wet form over the edges. This makes them look smooth and pebble-like. In some cases, I didn't leave quite enough of a lip, so I trimmed it with the shears. Now make sure to use a sharp set of leather shears and be very careful, because if done incorrectly, you can cut your fingers easily. Now you'll want to wet them to be able to wet form them, but you don't need to soak them, just enough to where they start forming, like you see here.
One eternity later.
Now, on to dyeing them. I got them laid out over some plastic to make it a little bit easier. You can just drop them into some dye, but I found that it ends up wasting a lot more dye than what I'd like, because the backs absorb a ton of it. Now here, I used Phoebing's Pro Oil Dye in black. Now, it's technically still an alcohol-based dye. They just call it oil dye because they mix some oils in it. That helps to keep the leather from cracking as it flexes because the alcohol tends to dry it out. Now, a little fun fact, this dye works great on wood too. Now, once you've gotten them all dyed, you'll want to seal them with your preferred clear coat. In this case, I had used a shinier spray sheen just to save me some time, but you can also use things like super sheen, acrylic resin, or other semi-glossy finishes. Now, once you're finished dyeing them, you can start attaching them to the various pieces. I started with the face mask, but you can start with the helmet top if you prefer. Either way, we have a lot of gluing ahead of us. At this point, I started setting up to install the spikes. I kind of measured the distance along the seam that I left open. And then I got everything prepped for the next part. Now you'll want to make a small slit from the underside, and you want to make sure that that slit is just a little bit smaller than the actual spike you're pushing through so it doesn't accidentally pop out. Alright everybody, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this build series, please leave a like, comment down below, and subscribe for more content. If you'd like to check out more of my videos, please click one of the links in the card. Thanks again, and I'll see you next week.